Welcome to We Lead Comms Debate number 4. We will start in approximately 2 minutes. Okay, no, wait a second. That one's going to the everyone. Welcome to the We Lead Comms Debate number 4. Is there a future for internal comms? My name is Mike Klein, and I am the founder of We Lead Comms, and I will be moderating today's discussion. Today's event is sponsored by the Center for Strategic Communication Excellence, a world leading training and development institute for communication professionals and business leaders looking to raise their communication game. Today, we are honored to have 3 heavy hitters in the world of communication, covering a range of disciplines, activities, and more precisely mindsets when it comes to our question of today: is there a future for internal communication? So, with Carrie Ann, Monique, and with Monique, Carrie Ann, and Kevin in alphabetical order. Monique, why don't you introduce yourself and have the others do the same? Monique, you're on mute.
And hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Mike. I'm a global employee communications expert based in Berlin. I've got several years of experience working across Australia, Germany, and also in America in all areas of comms, and have most recently written and got published my book, Internal Communications in the Age of Artificial Intelligence by Business Expert Press. So I'll hand over to Kevin.
All right, hello everybody. I'm Kevin Cohane. I'm a non-executive director at Brand Pi, and I lead the culture practice in North America. And I also run my own consultancy called Brand and Talent Unlimited. My background is really about 30 years, ranging from organizational transformation and change all the way through to employee communications, but more recently, really brand development, brand strategy, and go-to-market strategy, mainly for B2B companies. And I'll pass to Carrie Ann.
Thanks, Kevin. Hi, everyone. I'm Carrie Ann Stimson. I am the CMO, Chief Marketing Officer of the JMMB Financial Group. We're headquartered in Kingston, Jamaica, but we have operations across the Caribbean, Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados, and the Dominican Republic as well. And I've been in marketing for just over 20 years, but I also am very much active in what I call my passion project, which is I'm the producer and host of my very own podcast. It's called the Internal Marketing Podcast, which is the place where I have great conversations with awesome people like Mike. Mike is one of my former guests, where we talk about how brands can do a much better job of engaging their employees in the mission, the vision, the purpose of the brand that they represent, and how those employees can be empowered to advocate for the brand externally and to achieve organizational goals. So I'm very excited to be here and to have this conversation today.
Excellent, excellent. I just have a slate. Technology. Okay, we now have chat running. We had a little technical problem with chat. If you'd like to tell us where you're from and who you are, please feel free to pop that into the chat. In the meantime, I want to kick off with a question. That question is, could each of you give us about a minute or two explaining your initial answer to the question? is there a future for internal comms? And I'm going to kick off with Kevin because he and I have been talking about this for about 15 years since we were part of a one of the early collectives in the space called ComScrum, where we had our own blog and debated these very issues 15 years ago. Kevin, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Mike and I had a meal in London on Brick Lane, a really nice Indian meal, and we were arguing probably more than we should have. But I kind of came to the conclusion that is there a future for internal communications? Yes, as a capability within an organization. I'm less convinced it's actually a functional requirement in this day and age to have an actual person who has to quote unquote run internal communications. The reason for that, from my point of view, is that when you think about communications as a core skill set, which is you need to be able to understand the context you're communicating in, you need to understand your audience, you need to understand how to simplify and stage and prioritize and run air traffic control for messages. And there was a time when internal communications had a really powerful role to play in doing that. My argument is that with the advent of technology, with the advent of greater awareness and the diffusion of the skill set, it's really an organizational capability that needs to be nurtured rather than a functional role. And I'll stop there and you can pass over to the next one, Mike.
Monique, why don't you give it a shot?
We don't have a future unless we change. We're sitting in the wrong spot right now in many organizations, I think, not in terms of a functional perspective, but in terms of what our skills are and where we're actually promoting the value that we offer and that we add to the organization. I agree with Kevin that so many people with AI and these new tools can communicate, but we do definitely have a role as being the experts in understanding our organization and being able to provide that advice and guidance as to the best way to do things. I think there's there's a couple of things at play here, and my key message is that unless we change from being the button pushers and the content producers to very, very clearly defining our value in terms of stakeholder engagement, stakeholder management skills, managing the flow, and dare I say, promoting good, excellent internal communication in the organization, then we don't have an actual role in the future.
Carrie Ann, any thoughts?
Absolutely. Well, as the marketer, I really would love to say yes. I do believe that there's a future for comms, particularly internal comms. As a marketer, I just also believe that there needs to be a stronger symbiosis between the roles of marketing, which tends to be more externally focused, but a stronger symbiosis with the internal comms role. In the internal marketing conversation that I always like to have, I do believe that if as brands putting themselves out there and trying to, of course, grow, not only grow in terms of the brand, but grow our bottom line, grow our customer base, we can't do that without our people. And I see internal comms as one of those key functional areas that are part of a very important process of driving that engagement and excitement among our people who represent the brand. And so consistent with, I believe, Monique's point, which by the way, my middle name is Monique. We have that in common as well. I'm Carrie Ann Monique. But consistent with her point, is that we really have to see a partnership between the marketing function and the internal comms function centered around, yes, our people, and how are we really engaging our people, helping them to see and understand their role in growth and strategy development, so that ultimately what's felt externally by the brand is consistent with who we say we are, both inside and outside. So that's my view, Mike.
So we've got three pretty distinct views here. One who sees it as a capability, one who sees it as, you know, perhaps a missed opportunity if we're not careful. The other sees it as a core functional role. And I think that creates some really good table stakes for this conversation going forward. So I want to throw out a question for you, Monique, having written a book on the subject very recently. What do each of you think is the biggest challenge facing the world of internal communication at this time?
We need to upskill our leaders. That's our biggest challenge because it from that stems so many further challenges that we are facing. So we're going through incredible change at the time, and 82% of HR leaders, for example, say their managers aren't equipped to lead change. That's a Gartner report from earlier this year. And the recent IOIC index says that less than half of our internal comms professionals in the UK think that our leaders are effective at communicating with their employees. So we've got this issue where they're lacking in the skills of communication skills, and at the same time, without understanding what good communication is like from a leadership perspective, how can we expect them to understand the value that we bring? And so I think that's the biggest issue that we're facing right now. And melded and meshed into that is that concept of stakeholder engagement that I completely agree with Kerry Ann. We've got to be there helping consistency with the messaging and helping our leaders understand the value in that consistent messaging as well, internally and externally. So,
Carrie Ann, your thoughts?
I think just the ability to measure and communicate impact is from where I sit. So it's always, I like to say, it's great to do our own internal PR around communications and the value that it brings. But how do we communicate that in the language that the business understands, particularly the CEO and the CFO? And let's face it, their language is numbers, it's dollars and cents. And so if as a function we can, and I know this is a challenge sometimes even for marketers as well, is that if we can't get better at the whole process of communicating our value in a way that the C-suite can understand, particularly numbers, dollars, and cents, then I think then we would have gone a far way. But that's the biggest area of challenge that I think we can overcome to get where we need to go.
Kevin, your thoughts?
I don't have a lot to add to what's already been said, other than, and I think we're going to talk about the culture of the internal communications kind of industry, but I think this idea of always trying to convince people of the value we add and convince people of the business case and all, I think we've been beating that drum for 20 years. And my response to that has always been just go and make it happen. You know, the proof is in the doing, not in telling people the value it can add. And I think that's where a lot of internal communicators fall down. You know, they're trying to sell the value, not deliver the value.
No, and that's an interesting point, that there's a lot of kind of self-justification or even preemptive self-justification to try to get access to certain projects. One of the conversations that I had in my new upcoming podcast actually kind of blows the whole ROI conversation out of the water. Um, in saying that, my guest Darren Briggs was saying, rather than focus on ROI at all, bearing in mind that even though internal comms tends to be relatively cheap and it tends to produce high ROI, that's not necessarily, those numbers aren't what gets CEOs out of bed in the morning. But looking at what kind of risk do we mitigate, what kind of risk do we help manage that far exceed the cost of our interventions. Does anybody have any thoughts on, perhaps an alternative model focused on risk?
uh, yeah.
Kevin, you're eager, so let's go with you.
Oh, I think Monique had her hand up first.
Okay, Monique, let's go with you.
So risk is one of the key elements that I always include in a comms plan, risk and risk mitigation. I won't let any of my direct reports put out a comms plan without at least identifying. I think the key thing is understanding, again, it goes back to this stakeholder management, understanding what motivates that particular CEO or that particular leader. And as Kerry Ann said, speaking their language. If we're battering them over the head with ROI, 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 our value, and don't understand what their concerns are and address their concerns. I'm just trying to remember who was on LinkedIn the other day, who I think it was Jenny, said her biggest tip for people is to look at ways to make their manager happy. to stand out from the crowd. And that's what we need to be doing. We need to be understanding the motivation of our particular CEO or leader and addressing those. And if ROI is their concern, then we go down that road. If it's something else, then that's where we're headed to manage our stakeholders and demonstrate our value in their terms, on their terms.
So really what you're saying is that we should be led by the people that we're serving. Is that your take on it?
So we've got an obligation, obviously, to our employees and our people around us who we're communicating with. But at the end of the day, we have a manager, we have a CEO, we have a leader, we have a business, and they pay our wage. So it's about understanding what motivates our leaders and providing them with the best advice on their terms. So if it's understanding that, having that business acumen that Kerry-Anne was speaking about, and addressing what motivates them. If they're concerned about their external brand image, then let's demonstrate our value through those terms and show how activating our employees can maximize the return for them on that front.
Kevin, go ahead.
Yeah, so my thinking has evolved a fair bit on this. I wrote a book called Brand and Talent in 2013, very similar to what Carrie-Anne's been talking about, which is you've got a brand, and delivering it externally is really contingent on having the right people doing the right things internally and the right processes and so on. So I know that in the past 20 years, there's always been the conversation around, can't we get HR, marketing, and internal comms to circle the wagons and try to work together? And that's proven difficult and challenging for a number of reasons. My views evolved too. I don't think there's necessarily a role for an internal communications leader, but I actually think there is a role, and an emerging role, for a chief culture officer. And the chief culture officer's role would be to work with HR, work with marketing, work with finance, and basically coordinate, one, what is the employee experience that we need to deliver? What is the culture we need to build in order to deliver our brand externally? What are the tools we need to equip our people with, our managers with, what workflows and so on, in order to deliver on that promise? Then what we need to do is make sure that everything we're doing externally is doing the exact same thing, which is expressing the brand in the right way, delivering the right kinds of services, the right kind of brand experiences. I think it'd be a very interesting exercise to look at what is the customer expectation, right, of service. You could come up with 10, 15 things that the customer expects your business to deliver, either in a product or service manner. Then line up what are all the touch points internally in the employee experience that are affecting that customer experience, and what are the interventions we need to start putting in place, right? So work with, it might be a marketing problem, it might be an IT problem, it might be an HR problem, but line up interventions to start connecting that employee experience to that customer experience. And I think you do that through designing and building and defending and managing a culture. So a long-winded answer, but I think there's a great role for like a chief culture officer.
Putting your in-house hat on that, Carrie-Anne, interested in your take on, the extent to which that could fly and the extent to which communication is either sufficiently covered or is conspicuously missing from that framework.
Chief Culture Officer, it's interesting because in my organization, we actually don't call it HR, we call it the Culture and Human Development Unit, or CHDT, which is a bit more of a mouthful than HR. And so, yes, the head of CHDT really is that Chief Culture Officer. And in that structure, coincidentally, we have internal comms. And then marketing actually is connected through some kind of dotted line into that role as well. So it's very interesting that you bring that up, Kevin. I think what I found, as maybe again drawing from our experience, is that chief culture officer, we'd have to be very deliberate around what kind of skill set they have and how do they see the interconnectivity between marketing and internal comms. Because sometimes what tends to happen is certainly in our experience, is that the chief culture officer, though well-meaning, they may not necessarily be, they're not coming from a communications background. They still perhaps risk the possibility of seeing comms as just, again, the email drafters, the one that plans the team member events, that kind of thing. And then you have marketing kind of screaming on the other end for that kind of internal engagement that's going to support whatever is happening externally. So it would be I think the role is very critical. What I've seen in my experience is who sits in that role, what's their background, what's their experience, and how does that impact how those different functions come together to create that outcome.
I just want to jump in and kind of agree violently that it's kind of why I don't think there's a future for internal communications, because the role of this chief culture officer is really an orchestrator, and they will need to understand finance and marketing and HR and employee engagement and customer experience. They need to have a pretty generalist skill set, be able to speak the language of the C-suite. Curation, somebody just said, is a really important role. And the other point I would say is that not all of these problems are solved by communication. I think that's one of the big challenges with quote unquote internal comms, is that everything is a communication solution. Well, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's an operational solution. Sometimes, it's a workflow solution. Sometimes it's a talent solution. So I think that's one of the big pitfalls of internal comms in general, is let's communicate ourselves out of every problem.
Monique, you wanted to add.
I agree 100%, Kevin, that a lot of issues cannot be communication fixed, and that's again one of our roles, is to educate our leaders. If you've got a crap policy, you've got a crap policy. Comms is going to fix it. But I just wanted to jump on the chief culture officer, because I don't see that, for example, a sort of information security portfolio and some other maybe safety portfolio things, yes, they could be linked with culture, but I see a really clear communication need in these areas to inform, educate, inspire, and also to collect information. So we haven't yet spoken about the value of the feedback loop and being the ears on the ground and collecting that organizational listening part. And I don't see that a chief culture officer, I think their remit would be far too broad and far too thin to go across all of those areas where comms is definitely needed.
Well,
Just
I
so
think, sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to say, I can't actually write back in the chat, but there were a few questions that I wanted to address. Perhaps we can do that later on.
Yeah, I agree. It's a pretty broad remit, but I also think that prioritizing and being able to get other people in the organization to help deliver on that is important. Like, or listening, the listening organization. I think HR has in fact owned that space pretty effectively. Whether they're good at it or not, we can always debate. But HR has taken on a lot of what I think. I think Mike, you and I joked that HR came in and ate internal comms lunch while internal comms was asleep at the wheel. But I do think the role needs to be one that's strategic and about orchestration and prioritization. I don't think that you would be spread too thin. You'd have to, focus on the things that are really, really important.
Well, I mean, let me just take the HR has eaten the internal comms functions lunch question, because it kind of lines up with the next question, but I wanted to address that specifically. I mean, HR has taken ownership of a lot of the things that internal comms does, and in many places it's taken over ownership of internal comms, more for imperialistic reasons rather than strategic reasons. And I think part of the problem with internal comms is the extent to which we're aligned with HR rather than with operations or with marketing or with functions that are actually trying to put runs on the board. But that much being said, I chose the use of the hashtag internal comms to frame this debate, because I wanted to specifically address the current culture of the profession, setting aside the discussion of whether or not internal comms as a profession. So I've got a four-part question here. Part one: to what extent is the culture of the profession the problem? Got to go with you, Kevin, on this one.
Um, I probably sound like I'm really being harsh on internal comms, and I'm not because I did it for a long time. I think what it comes down to is there's a culture that's built up, and you and I have seen it over the past 20 years of kind of asking forgiveness, not permission, really not being as proactive and as challenging and as active as you would see other functional leaders be. Almost this apologetic, back to what we said earlier, is, trying to prove our value, trying to prove our value. And, a CEO, a chief marketing officer, a chief human resource officer is going to react a lot more positively to an internal communications professional who drives things and gets stuff done, finds ways to overcome resource constraints and so on, rather than the person coming saying, oh, if you only gave me more money, I could do this, this, and this.
Can I say, I think it depends which organization you're in and how it's set up as to what you would or one would define the culture as. In terms of our profession, I think it also depends on the country, and there are other elements there. So I'd be happy to generalize, but I'm keen to hear, Kerry Ann, your thoughts.
So I actually was a bit hesitant kind of jumping in because not being a direct comms professional in the internal comms sense, I didn't want to speak too directly on the culture. I really would be just observing from the outside. I mean, from where I sit, I just think that there is probably just, depending on who you speak to, there is a sense of despair there. In another sense, there's a sense of concern. And there's just a sense of, well, despondency. So do we have people in the professional who really feel that, if we're not being given the level of value or the level of importance that we need to be given for the role that we play and the contribution that we make, then what's the purpose? And I think that sometimes that could be a self-fulfilling prophecy, because sometimes you'd really want, and speaking as a marketer here, you really want the internal comms professional to step up to the plate and contribute and play that active role. But the self-fulfilling prophecy comes in where they come into the conversation, if they choose to come in in a very timid fashion, and not coming with that sense of bravado and expertise that we really want them to have. And so that's kind of what I'm picking up just as someone externally. And I think there's such a great opportunity for the professionals to really assess the mindset and assess the thinking that they have around their role and how that shift can take place so that they do come to the table in the way that we need them to show up.
So basically, what you're saying is that the key element of the culture of the profession is an undue degree of deference, an undue degree of passivity, and an unwillingness to be proactive in drive, perhaps even an unwillingness to take risks in um, taking action in the pursuit of whatever the organization's chosen outcomes are, rather than continually seeking permission and validation and recognition and access. Um, what do you think, if you were advising, say, a mid-career communication, say somebody who's like 40, who's been a communication associate, a doer, somebody running specific stuff, what advice would you give them to break through that?
I, I think it's really important to acknowledge that it's so easy for me to sit here and say, be more proactive, blah, blah, blah. But it's hard because, most internal communicators are, struggling to maintain stakeholder relationships. They're probably in a kind of content generation and channel management role, and that's incredibly time consuming and challenging. So just doing the day job is absolutely exhausting, and I want to acknowledge that. So I guess my advice would be try to find ways to do less, but do it more effectively, if that makes sense. I think there's probably a lot of activity that your average internal communications professional spends a lot of time on, and it might not necessarily be having the impact that's important. And that, again, stopping doing things is really, really a great thing to do. And it's going to take stakeholder management because there are people who are going to say, I don't want you to stop doing that. So Mike, to boil it down, I'd say try to stop doing as much as you're doing and do better, do fewer things better.
Monique.
One, and this is a huge shout out to Claire Gunning, anyone who's in Australia, in Australian government. She was an amazing leader in the comm space and actually invested in her team. And we all did a consultancy skills course, which upskilled us in those stakeholder management areas, how to have difficult conversations, how to extract information, how to prioritize and plan for the meetings before jumping in. And this was the biggest tip that I can give anyone, and it's something I've tried to give people I've worked with as well, is again showing up at the table, Carrie Ann, as you said, confident and understanding who your stakeholders are and being able to influence. And that comes back to one of the comments that someone earlier, I think the chat, I can't write in the chat, but I just wanted to acknowledge, if you don't agree with your leader, that it's your job to influence to the best of your ability and then decide whether you need to let it to go through to the keeper, which is Australian football, not football, cricket terms for not catching the ball, or if you're going to go in to bat and the risk of that. And also maybe you need to find another manager. I mean, our values are also important for us too. So in a shortened answer there, Mike, I think the biggest thing that we can give people are those stakeholder management skills and investing in those consultancy skills as well.
So aside from stakeholder management skills, 'cause I think the key thing is we've addressed the culture of the profession. There's a proactivity slash, you know, exhaustion piece. There's so many people who are saying, I don't have time, there's too much to do. I can't keep track of what I'm barely keeping ahead of what I'm being asked to do, etc. Um, the issue is how do you overcome it, break that cycle, etc. And then the stakeholder management skills being critical to that piece. But I want to ask about the overall skill set because it ties into, some more practical discussions about, what the role looks like going forward, if anything. What is a viable skill set for a quote unquote professional internal communication person? Carrie Ann, why don't you give that one a go?
Well, I'll lean on more of the softer, or some folks call it real skills. Well, certainly we've been talking about it, your ability to show leadership qualities, in being able to influence folks, being able to just have the right conversation. I'd also like to jump in on the more the hard skill side. I think if you have some measure of analytical skills, that would be great. Because again, if you're trying to demonstrate value and connecting the dots, your comms team is going to have some understanding of how do we demonstrate value numerically, quantitatively. Yeah, I'd add that in there. So that's my 2 cents on that.
And I think speaking of quantifying, I guess another thing to look at is looking at how the organization itself makes money. Because if you
Yes,
don't understand that, then it's hard to model your return on investment if you don't know
absolutely.
what impact you're having on the actual business activities. In terms of additional skills, Monique, do you have any thoughts on that before I bring this down to Kevin with a slightly different take on the question?
Sure. I do think in this day and age, you still need to have those basic skills of knowing what good comms looks like. It sounds very, it still sounds very sort of maybe transactional. I know we've been speaking about stakeholder engagement and all these other sort of influential skills, but I think the basics are still important, at least for the moment. When we look at something that's come out of ChatGPT, we need to know what good looks like. Sure, ChatGPT can provide content, but it's up to us to know, yes, the angle is right, or yes, the emphasis is in the right place, and how things are structured. I think that's going to change over time, but those basic skills are still, I think, quite important, at least for the next half year to a year, I would say minimum.
This leads to a Kevin flavored version of the question, which is given those skills that have been articulated by Carrie Ann and Monique, who are the other people who could do this job?
Well, let me answer the question first before I move forward to that, because I do have a take that I think is a good one, which is one of the reasons people struggle with change and internal communications and doing the job well is it's really complicated, right? Organizations are really complex. You've got, personalities, bad processes, good processes, agendas, all that sort of stuff swirling around. And so I think the key is to come up with a framework that will simplify it so that you can do your job better, right? So the more you can simplify, the better job you can do. What Where I've arrived and where I'm seeing success with organizations is if you break it down, again, really simply defining what is the employee experience that you need in the organization, right? And that spans finance, HR, communications, management, leadership and development, talent, behavioral science. Define what your culture is, how you're going to measure it, what is the employee experience that you're going to deliver and you have to deliver, and also understand then what is the customer experience or the external stakeholder experience you need to deliver. And again, connect those dots, because that will very quickly help you prioritize and simplify what you're doing as a communicator. So that comes back to your question, Mike, which is who can do this job? And it goes back to the point of I don't think you need to have the title internal communicator, because it's actually much bigger than that, which is why I thought elevating it to more of an orchestration role who can tap the capabilities within the organization to execute. To Monique's point, absolutely, you need to have some fundamental skills. But I would add that, and this might be contentious, smart communication, doing the right thing and executed badly, is better than really well executed stupid communication.
Oh, I couldn't agree with you more on that. That's an excellent point. But I think we've done a really good job of kind of splitting the orchestration role from the execution role. And in doing so, it leaves a big gap in the area of execution. So the question is, you know, if we're not going to have internal communicators executing, who are the other people who can do the executing, or is this time to start seriously thinking about having non people do some of this stuff? Monique, why don't you give that a roll?
Sure. Absolutely. I'm a big advocate for a service model. So the priority high risk projects are managed by a comms person, but then other areas of the business are given the resources and templates, and whether it's a Canva type product where they can easily make the content with some guidelines and some templates, then I say go for it. It's no different from what you were saying, Kevin, where we need to be focusing on the stuff that matters and prioritizing. And I think, or I know that there's large areas of the organization who can self-serve with these new tools, templates. They don't even have to be hugely sophisticated, but again, it's our role to upskill and to set the example and be the go-to people for the guidance, I think, there.
Kevin.
Well, I'm not sure if this is answering the question. I just wanted to give an example of how I thought it might work. So if you understand that, let's say you've got a call center or a digital contact center, a contact center, and you have identified that one of the things that your customer experience needs to be is the person on the other end of the phone or the email or whatever, the chat, needs to understand you as a customer. That's the expectation you've set in the marketplace. So they also want to be treated with empathy and dignity and respect. And let's just pick those two. What are you doing as an organization to help the person in that contact center deliver those two things? Now, one might be, hiring the right kind of people who, hire the smile kind of thing. Second thing might be, maybe it's an IT problem. Maybe this person in the contact center has to use 3 different systems to find out what they need to know about the customer, which slows them down, makes them miss things, make mistakes, which affects the customer experience. So again, that connection of what you're trying to promise to the marketplace and what you need to promise and deliver to your people internally, that's kind of the skill set that you need to nurture. And again, I think it comes down to defining what that culture is and what interventions you need to put in place in order to support people in thriving in that culture and delivering what they need to deliver, the tools that they need, but it's not always a communication solution.
Well, let me bounce something back to you, Kevin. Then, you've got this digital call center and you're optimizing the customer employee experience. What happens when there's some news like half of the island is going to be out of service for the next 2 days? What happens then in that scenario?
You have a smart communication channel that delivers that message to people. The one
And
that's
who
right for the
runs that
audience.
channel? How
I
does
don't
that
think it has
channel
to be an internal
populate itself?
communication. I don't think content and channel has to be attached to an internal communications role. That could very easily be something that's handled by the risk part of the organization. It's a communication capability, right? We need to tell people the power is going to be out on half the island, right? I don't think that necessarily maps to it's the job of internal communications to do that as a functional role.
Fair enough.
I
Monique.
I strongly disagree. I think there's room for a multidisciplinary team when it comes to working out the employee experience, where you'd have the person who's a hiring expert, you'd have the person who's the maybe the facilities management who creates the beautiful working environment. You'd have the internal comms person who works out how can we minimize the noise and impact on employees, how can we engage with them, how can we make sure we have that organizational listening. So I think there's what you're talking about in terms of the call center. There needs to be a multidisciplinary team that looks at that problem from different angles, because otherwise we're all coming at the diamond from the same angle and you miss the beauty and you miss the 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 beautiful result from the different sides. In terms of the second point with the
Well,
second point
sorry, I'm gonna
with,
jump in there because we're taking this is a debate. What you just
yeah, of
described is
course.
exactly what you just described is exactly what a chief culture officer role would do.
But that's not it. But I think there's an internal comms person or expert who needs to sit in that multidisciplinary team. And yes, it does need to be led by a project manager of some sort. And I don't mind what they're called. There needs to be a project manager for that. But I think there's a role for the internal comms expertise to make sure that those areas are being addressed. I've worked with building property at ANZ Bank, which is one of Australia's largest 4 banks. And although they've got the capability, or they had the capability for the property people to communicate with the employees, something as basic as toilets, and I use this example in my book, toilets being unavailable on level 5, they didn't have the skills to communicate that in a clear, understandable way. And that's where it didn't take much of our time, but it was reducing the risk of huge confusion. And particularly when we're talking about BCM, so business continuity issues. So in Australia, I was working with not only with the COVID, where there was a COVID outbreak in an office building, we had to let everybody know straight away, like, how do you inform people without making them panic? How do you, we had was it a fire in another office with business continuity? How do you pre-plan the comms? How do you work through that in a way that is clear and understandable for employees, that gets them to do or think or whatever you need them to in the quickest, safest way, and also who understands the channels. So we had a lot of, for example, with a government department that I was working with, we had a lot of IT outages. And so we had some leaders who wanted to email everyone, but it's like, well, the email's not working, people. You can't reach them on email. So it came again to our expertise of understanding the best way to reach our employees, and not panic them, and make sure that the processes were in place as well. So in that case, I believe it was Yammer, and we also had SMS functionality. But yeah, I've seen a lot of distress as well come from leaders who send out team restructure emails right before Christmas, and employees are already on leave, all sorts of just horrific employee experience, coming from people who, or leaders who maybe aren't equipped with the communication skills that they need. And that's where I think our role is.
I'd like to bounce this off Carrie Ann, because I think that the conversation that's been taking place about, does this need to be interdisciplinary? Does this need to be transdisciplinary? Do we need to have dedicated support or simple competence, or complete devolution? I think the conversation about internal marketing is a completely different take, which is around, you know rather than having internal comms as an immutable part of the culture bucket, where does it fit in terms of a marketing driven frame of mind, where there's a very clear case for having this resource available? Carrie Ann, your thoughts?
Thanks, Michael. I've been itching in my seat for a few questions back because I'm listening to all the points come up. I mean, when we talk about internal marketing, yes, it's a nomenclature that, as you can probably tell from my passion project, doesn't get half the love that it deserves. Of course, it's been around for quite some time, but what it really drives at the heart of is, of course, when we think about marketing, we're talking about changing behavior, right? Changing behavior to whatever is the outcome that what we seek, right? And typically, of course, in marketing, traditional external marketing, the behavior we want is for customers to buy what it is we're selling, or certainly to choose our brand over whoever our competitors are. So when we bring it internally now, which is where the internal marketing conversation happens, it's recognizing that who our target audience is of course our employees. But in the same way that marketing and marketing communications, they work together, but they're not exactly the same thing. In my view, internal marketing and internal comms must work together, though they're not exactly the same thing. And when we think about the four basic P's of marketing, the place, the price, the product, the promotion, internal comms being that key functional part of the mix, where we talk about the promotion component in internal marketing. To go back to a point earlier, well, what about the product, which is the job, the culture, the employee experience? How do we understand our employees, that don't, not just looking at them as a collective, but understanding the different segments between our employee that exist among our employees, and why are they our employees? We can't just assume that they're here because they signed on the dotted line. I think there's just a tremendous opportunity for us to recognize that a broader look of at the organization from a marketing perspective that says, hey, we want to shift the behavior. We need internal communications, absolutely, as part of that messaging and the driving of that component of the framework. But there's also the component of looking at it as well. These are employees, this is who we're speaking to, but what does our culture look like? What's the experience, the compensation? What are the things that we have in place that we use to engage them in a way that gets the outcome that we want? I think that's where the broader picture looks. I mean, to go back to Kevin's point about the chief culture officer, what would really be wonderful to me is somebody like a chief internal marketing officer that really brings that all together. And yes, it's a multifunctional role, but it multifunctional, it will require different functional areas contributing to create that ultimate outcome. But yes, I believe that the two need to work together, and that's how I see looking at the organization from that marketing mindset.
Kevin, any thoughts?
Yes. Um, Mike's aware that I did a blog for about 10 years called Death to Internal Marketing. So Carrie Ann, I think
And Kevin,
I
you
think
have to come on my podcast, by the
all right.
way. We need to
Um,
duke this out.
yeah, exactly. I think that the skill set of a marketer plays a huge role in defining and equipping people with some of the information they would need inside an organization. Um, the big problem I have with that, and I always have had with that, is that while the skill set and the approach is really the same, as an employee, don't market to me because I'm not a customer, right? If I sniff marketing, like you're trying to sell me on something inside my company, just from a behavioral science point of view, that's going to be a pretty hard sell. I do think, however, that what we've been talking about, where if we do have a defined customer experience and our entire organization is wired to deliver that customer experience through a well-defined, well-supported employee experience, then of course audience segmentation, personalization of messages, prioritization of the right channel to reach those people, all of those marketing disciplines actually apply. But I don't think employees like to be sold to.
And I agree. And I think that that's the issue with the nomenclature, is that what I'm not proposing that we sell to them. I'm proposing that we see them as people with different things that motivate their behavior, understand what those motivations are, and then, of course, using the promotion or the messaging or the communications component of the framework to shift to that behavior. The thing is, when we talk about who we're speaking to and who we target, and I talk about like external marketing, customers, of course, choose us, and they can choose not to buy from us. They can choose from our competitors. With our employees, it's quite different. Yes, they would have signed on the dotted line and they would have chosen to come and work with us. The challenge that we have is that once they come in, depending on what they experience or what other factors are impacting them externally, whether it be family, their community, whatever, some employees actually don't necessarily want to be there. Some may want to leave and can't leave. There are some people who are very happy being there. What I'm suggesting is recognize that not because they're employees and sign on the dotted line to be here, that they actually want to be here, or they're not, or they're all on the same level as it pertains to engagement. And so what's important for us, in the same way you use that marketing mindset, is segmenting our employees along those lines, demographics, psychographics, and then use our communications capabilities to shift the behavior in a way that we want to see to create the outcome that we want to see. So for those employees who are the raving fans, how are we leveraging them to help drive that engagement? For those employees who are not as engaged and they're like on the way out, if we can't manage them out as quickly as we'd like, what can we do to help shift that behavior? So it's not so much this, it's not selling, it's just communicating with them in a way that helps to shift the behavior we want to see based on how they are structured, segmented between their demographics, psychographics, and just their overall level of
And
engagement.
it's probably, looking at the chat, I agree it's a semantic argument, because I agree with everything you're saying. I mean,
Yeah.
about 20 years ago, at Enterprise IG, we created something called the buy-in benchmark, which some people, it's become a pretty common tool, but it basically was a 2x2 where you had hearts and minds, right? You didn't win hearts and you didn't win minds, you had people who were just checked out. If you won minds, but not hearts, you basically had loose cannon, or you basically had bystanders. If you had hearts but not minds, you had loose cannons. And what you wanted to do is make sure you got both hearts and minds. So it was a kind of a nice way of thinking through, how do you identify where people are, and then what are the interventions you need to put in place in terms of messaging, communications, and driving behavior change. So I absolutely agree that the skills and the tools you apply are the same. I just really bristle at calling it internal marketing.
Go ahead.
I agree the skills are transferable. but it's that understanding of the actual audience and how uh, the this your audience reacts, what you're trying to achieve. We also have a, as I mentioned earlier, a duty of care. The relationship's actually quite different from a marketing which is selling driven, marketing opening doors for sales, for business success, or for brand. There's a slightly different relationship there with the employees that you've touched on, Kerry Ann, and also Kevin, in terms of that engagement piece, the motivation. Belinda Ganaway and I did a model with where there's employee strategic alignment, employee experience, and employee engagement that all feed into each other in sort of a circle where you need all of these elements for this ongoing success, for that presenteeism, I think is the best way to put it, and effective employees that are not only engaged, but actually working on the right projects in the right direction. I've come across a lot of organizations where you've got like super engaged employees, but when you look at what they're spending their time on, it's actually not aligning to business goals or not aligning to the priorities in that team or that organization. But they're super engaged and super happy. They're the free range chickens, kind of.
Free range headless chickens,
That's
basically.
right. But Mike,
Yeah.
again,
And
I'm being
and
deliberately
I think there's that
provocative.
strategic alignment is missing.
What does that have to do with
Sorry,
internal
Kevin.
communication?
Well,
Oh,
that's a good question. I think that's a question for us to ponder as we move forward because we're coming up to the top of the hour, and I sneakily snuck in, as one sneakily does, a quick poll to answer the question: is there a future for internal comms? And I think, given that Kevin was being more provocative than determinative, I'm not surprised with the result, which was we had as the effectively the equivalent of a North Korean election here. 100% of the votes voted in the affirmative of is there a future for internal comms. At the same time, I think the view that we have of that future has been altered by participating in this conversation. And so I want to thank each of you very much, Monique, Carrie Ann, and Kevin, for really giving this your all and being provocative and saying what you felt and looking at, you know, how we can question our own role so that we could actually make much more of a difference. So this concludes We Lead Comms debate number 4. We Lead Comms debate number 5 is coming up in September. And the question is, what are the top ethics issues facing the world of comms? So once again, thank all of you. And I want to thank especially the Center for Strategic Communication Excellence, our sponsors and friends who've made this possible. Thank you very much for your participation today.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
thank you.